Are you a victim?
America is very racist.
Black people have been consistently oppressed.
I think there's people that think they're victims and they're not.
So what groups should receive reparations then?
Start with black people.
My community deserves it because of the things that we've been through.
That's up what they did. They need to pay that back. So I'm out here today, and the question I'm asking is, should Americans pay for reparations?
Depends. Who are we talking about?
In San Francisco, they're looking to increase taxes to pay reparations for black people, as well as universal basic income for trans people.
Modern day society should be paying reparations to the black people that you had mentioned just because of everything that they've faced, but I do not believe that we should be paying for trans people to not have to work.
I think it depends totally on the situation because like in your example, all black people, that's a huge demographic. Not every black person has been quote unquote oppressed.
I mean, especially with black and trans people, I think that they're given a lot of like opportunities. Like I'm doing investment banking recruiting right now. I know for people for diversity, equity, and inclusion, they can access the interviewing process a lot sooner and a lot earlier than I can, for example. I think black Americans have an equal opportunity to achieve like anything that any other race can in the US.
How do you determine if a certain group is oppressed to be able to get those reparations?
Obviously, if they're black.
There's a lot of f***ed up history in this country, and I think that to take the step to do right, just to go forward and say that we made this happen and we're sorry, and here's a way to, bring you guys to a level of equality.
For the black community specifically, reparations will go a long way just because I think a lot of people don't really understand that our community is set up for failure sometimes. A lot of people come from homes that are not only just broken, but are financially illiterate, so they don't know how to use money. Giving them reparations would hopefully set them off with a bigger platform than what they generally would have.
That's a really important point that you brought up though, because yeah, you can give people money, but if they don't have the necessary skills to invest it or keep it or save it, then that will be gone in seconds, right?
It could definitely do more harm than good if it's put into the wrong hands.
Because today, cities in California are proposing reparations as high as $5 million per eligible black person, as well as universal basic income for trans people.
The city of San Francisco is considering an idea to pay
Reparations for the black community.
Liberation starts with money.
For transgender and non-binary residents.
But with a looming recession and America's continued divide, we must question if reparations would fix past wrongs or create unintended consequences. Because what exactly is a victim if we're all victims to some degree? And is money truly the solution? Or is it more money, more problems? Guess we gonna see. So what groups should receive reparations then?
Start with black people.
So would this be like any black person? Like let's say if they have like descendants from slaves, or is this just a black person? Let's say if they just came from Jamaica or Africa, would they be entitled to reparations?
The difference between like black American, me, myself, right, and someone from Jamaica or Africa is they have a place to call home. For a lot of black Americans, their whole ethnic identity was erased by slavery.
So you said that you should start with like black people, then who should be like the next group next?
Probably the gays. I don't know how much they need it though, because they're doing pretty well, but
yeah, I've never met a poor gay person.
Yeah, they're doing great for themselves.
I think it should be for everybody. My community deserves it because of the things that we've been through. I would be remiss to say another community doesn't deserve something because they're a little bit more set up than my community.
So, but would it be like equal amounts across the board, or would there be like, I hate to say this, like a stack ranking of who was more oppressed?
That I don't know.
I think that we should look at who we oppress the most for the longest amount of time and then do right by them.
Everyone has their own rights to identify as a victim, but at the end of the day, it's not going to get you where you want to be. I think that you can cash checks and spend the money, but if you're not putting in the work, you're never going to learn, and none of the generations after you are going to learn either.
And when there's a race for who's the biggest victim, there will be consequences for paying some groups and others not. So I was curious to hear the other side. Would you say though that certain groups in America are more likely to face, let's say, systemic oppression?
Especially like now we have like affirmative action. If anything, that levels the playing fields or puts them at an advantage for a lot of certain opportunities. But I think there are definitely certain instances of racism, and you can't root out all racism. I think that there are generally equal opportunities.
Besides all the controversies surrounding affirmative action, is this even a valid form of repayment? Do you think affirmative action is a form of reparations?
It would depend on who you're talking to, honestly. To a kid in Compton who has no means of getting out of that little area, it might not be the same. Sometimes your surroundings, especially in an environment where you don't feel like you can make it out, can seem very overwhelming. So it's hard to think outside of that.
So when affirmative action has been deemed legal by law, does that signal a government's obligation to solve inequality? And if so, through financial or other means, to what extent?
the forces of Germany have surrendered to the United Nations.
Die Bundesregierung wird in Zukunft in ihren Bemühungen die Verteidigung der Freiheit nicht nachlassen.
After World War II in 1952, Germany signed the first set of reparations agreements to compensate Holocaust survivors, which is to this day has paid out a total of 80 billion euros.
We owe that to those who survived and bravely carried the burden of their painful memories.
And despite obvious frustrations over payments, there's been decent support from Germans over the years and at least no instances of anti-Semitic backlash. And since then, reparations have been ongoing, where even this past year, Germany announced the largest ever package of 1.2 billion for remaining survivors. And with 80% of survivors in Eastern Europe below the poverty line, financial reparations have definitely made a benefit. And together with symbolic reparations such as Holocaust museums and memorials, Germany has made efforts to ensure atrocities are not forgotten or repeated. But it raises the question, were the intentions behind the reparations out of genuine guilt or to buy cooperation? Because for initial recipients, not all were in favor. Some Jews opposed the idea of reparations as blood money in an insult and commodification to their suffering. And especially when we look at Germany's history with reparations, it may reveal answers. The Treaty of Versailles imposed heavy reparations on Germany after World War I, which led to economic instability and political unrest that contributed to the rise of Nazi Germany and ultimately to World War II. And so whether it's fair to view it this way or not, are reparations a mere transactions that creates more problems than it solves? And so I wanted to ask a Jewish person whose family has experienced the Holocaust. Do you think governments have a moral obligation to pay for certain injustices?
When the government's paying for it, it's coming out of taxpayer money. I'm a Jewish person, right? A lot of my relatives have been killed off in the Holocaust. There's even a lot of anti-Semitism towards Jews. Jews weren't allowed in specific areas and jobs. Today, I think my family's overcome that. So especially me, someone that wasn't around in the 1800s when slavery was going on in the U.S., I don't think that I'm responsible as a taxpayer to pay for that.
Which brings up a point, because where would the money come from? How would we pay for reparations or universal basic income?
Well, taxes, right? I mean, that's the obvious answer.
It'll probably be incentivized as some tax or something, probably gonna come out of our money.
So in that sense then, what would be the point of the reparations then in terms of financial incentive?
Think of it like you pay taxes for police officers, firefighters, stuff like that. It might not seem the same, but you don't even think twice about it, right?
So you're saying raising taxes but then changing the reallocation of the funds. Okay.
Money's all made up, so we're not really paying for anything because we're always in debt. So
money's fake.
Yeah, absolutely. Just make up something and give it to black people so they're happy, bro.
I mean, you could take the taxes we're already paying that are going out of the country to pay for those instead of sending billions of dollars to Ukraine.
Because when we compare the seemingly relative lack of investment in domestic services, from infrastructure, public education to the homelessness crisis, in contrast to the billions of investment in foreign aid, it does make you question, is it about the lack of funds or is it about the priorities? Since the invasion of Ukraine by Russia on February 24th, 2022, America has directed more than $75 billion in aid, far more than any other country.
The United States will support the Ukrainian people as they defend their country.
On one side, one can make the argument that foreign aid takes precedence as it's in the name of national security, and that despite perception, it's actually a small part of the overall budget. But on the other side, with a looming recession and rising inflation, are Americans starting to feel as if priorities need to shift to domestic initiatives like reparations? But at the same time, is giving money always the viable solution? A study on stimulus checks to poor Americans from amounts ranging from half a month's worth of income to even 2 months' income showed that it didn't have any positive impacts on financial, physical, or psychological well-being. And not only did it not increase incentive to save more money, it caused distress in the subjects as they were made more aware of the gap between what they had and what they wanted but didn't have. And so I wanted to apply these findings in the context of reparations. Do you think reparations or universal basic income will incentivize hard work and personal responsibility?
I think in general, it definitely can have that effect on people if they just know they're going to be getting, a $2,000 settlement check a month, then they can sit on their ass and do nothing.
I do think our image necessarily isn't always the best. I think that sometimes the media takes the worst of us and they use that as examples. I know a lot of hardworking black men and women who are financially literate, who know what to do with money. If those people were highlighted in our community more, then we'd be looked at in a different light.
We're going to eventually get to a point where we can't sustainably house and pay everybody. If they don't have a job, we should be figuring out how we can get this person to be a contributor to our society.
Do you trust the government?
I don't trust anybody, bro.
So in that sense, would you want the government to be controlling a system like that?
Absolutely not.
So then who would control it?
That's a big question.
So the question is there a precedence of reparations in America?
Our West Coast became a potential combat zone.
During the same time as the Holocaust in 1942, the U.S. government forced around 120,000 Japanese Americans in internment camps for national security reasons.
All of them, citizens and aliens alike, would have to move.
In the camps, Japanese Americans faced poor conditions and racial discrimination and were forced to leave their homes, businesses, and belongings behind. And although they were released after the war, many had lost their pre-war belongings and property to vandalism and theft. But in 1988, a significant step was taken in U.S. history to acknowledge the wrongs. Through sustained efforts by political groups and campaigns, Japanese Americans achieved reparations from the U.S. government of $20,000 each.
For here we admit a wrong. Here we reaffirm our commitment as a nation to equal justice under the law.
And so then, why haven't reparations been achieved after centuries of slavery in America? And there seems to be several factors behind this uncomfortable truth. The number of Japanese American victims were relatively small, and more importantly, easily identifiable, as many were still alive when reparations were approved. And along with it came strong unity rallying around symbolic victims. Both Daniel Inouye and Spark Matsunaga eventually became US senators and served as strong advocates for demand. Whereas for slavery, it's difficult to identify the perpetrators and which people of African descent today are descendants of those enslaved. And since no direct victims are alive today, there are also no symbolic victims that can rally efforts. Stuart E. Eisenstadt, who was an American diplomat that helped negotiate Holocaust reparations with Germany, argued that reparations are complicated, contentious, and messy, and work best when the crime was recent and the direct victims are still alive. But as echoed by Thomas Kramer, a professor of public policy, using distance and time as an argument against reparations is also damaging. And that it signals that just because you commit a historical injustice and that you waited long enough, it doesn't count anymore. And so it's obvious that reparations involve multiple factors, which tracks both supporters and opponents. And so it makes you wonder, if reparations are approved, how will people react? What impact would reparations have on racial relations in America?
Everyone's going to start becoming more resentful towards everyone instead of creating this equal playing field. If everyone's always thinking like, you owe me, there's never going to be that sense of we're equal.
I don't think it's necessarily just going to offset everything we've done.
Would it do anything?
I mean, it might create short monetary gain for a select amount of people, but there's so many different people that have been oppressed in the U.S.
Is the $2 million or the $10 million or whatever blanket amount of money even going to fix the level of injustice? I don't really have a great perspective because I am not a victim, but if you just gave me a set amount of money to fix oppression or injustice I've been through, to me, I don't really think it would be enough.
What would be the success measures for reparations?
For black people, the most important thing is like finding a place in this country to say like, hey, this is home. So I'm not saying like give people money as reparations. I'm saying giving them property as reparations.
I wouldn't necessarily tie it to like you get a check, but if you were to say like, hey, we'll give you reparations in the form of giving you your first property, then that's real reparations, because you're setting yourself up for at least generations.
If reparations go through, do you think it creates a more equal society, or do you think it'll create more division and resentment?
Resentment is all about mentality. If you're worried about the next person, then of course you would resent them.
And so if the focus as a society is always on past injustices, is it making it easier to have a negative mentality towards one another? From 1948 to 1994, the apartheid in South Africa was a system designed to establish and maintain white minority rule over the black majority population.
Apartheid, the policy of good neighborliness.
What sense of justice will they ever have if they're treated this way?
And once the apartheid was abolished, the Truth and Reconciliation Committee was established as a forum for victims to share their stories and for perpetrators to confess to their crimes.
I assaulted you. What kind of men are you?
And with over 22,000 statements broadcasted on national TV, the aim was to expose the atrocities, provide reparations, and most importantly, to promote national unity. And so, was it successful in doing so? On the one hand, establishing a hearing to encourage honest and open dialogue helped establish reparation payments along with a framework for accountability. But at the same time, the same dialogue that involves opening up wounds of the past didn't come without a cost. South Africa is still seeking cohesion as the most unequal country in the world, where the divide between rich white minority and poor black majority is still greater than ever.
Poverty in South Africa is still largely defined by the skin color.
And when it's revealed that the government did not fulfill the reparations program fully, such as land reparations, it becomes clear why a majority of the land is still owned by whites.
The narrative that the land was stolen must stop because it's false.
And like a wound left untreated that worsens over time, empty promises lead to further distrust and inequality. And if paying reparations can lead to further division, is reparations a viable solution, or will it create more problems for the future? And are we too attached to our own stories that we're unable to seek a solution? Let me ask you this. Would you say you're a victim?
You know, I've definitely experienced anti-Semitism, but I don't carry that with me every day.
I don't blame anyone personally. I blame the systems that were put in place before all of us were here.
I don't think about like how hard I had it. I think about moving forward. If I just take it for what it is and realize that I'm in control of my life and I can push it forward, I'll be okay.
I mean, anyone can be a victim. It's really what's on the other side, what happens then.
Do you think victimhood is a mentality?
It can be an influence, for sure.
I think there's people that think they're victims and they're not. There are true victims out there. I'm not a victim of anything. I've been very blessed and grateful. I don't take that for granted.
Being a victim, while it can sometimes be a choice, it's also something that happens to you.
And if anyone can claim victimhood, it's Viktor Frankl. In his book Man's Search for Meaning, Frankl describes his firsthand experience of the suffering in the concentration camp. And even though he was a victim in every sense of the word, Frankl realized that victimhood was a choice. Frankl argues that those who started seeing themselves as victims became passive and helpless, while those who chose to take ownership had the power and agency to survive. And so Frankl, suffering in the most hopeless of situations, what he realized was that the last thing they can take from you is your ability to choose your response.
If we cannot change the situation, we have always the last freedom to change our attitude to that situation.
Because just like many of you that luckily have never been in concentration camps, you and I can both relate to times that we felt like victims. Whether it be being bullied, feeling inferior and out of place at the new school, or thinking that girls will never like me because of my race. Because no matter how valid your claim to victimhood, it's the classic case of play stupid games and win stupid prizes, and the prize usually being more division. Because true empowerment is the realization that no one's here to save you and that you're completely okay with it. And that's exactly the mission of exploring the unfamiliar. And with that said, thanks for watching, and like, comment, and subscribe if you want to see more content where I turn street interviews into investigative journalism. And if YouTube gets it right, like this video too.